wanted to do was give you our recommendations. Like if I was the CMO of a beauty brand, what would be my KPIs when it comes to influencer marketing? Like what would I choose? And also what would I not choose so that you aren't using the wrong things? And I think you guys will be more informed than your average person, but hopefully you get one or two good insights out of this. High level too, just so you guys know, I think you guys all know EMV, but for those that aren't in it every day, we're going to track every piece of content created by influencers. We're going to value that content based on consumer engagements. So likes, comments, shares, retweets, repins. In general, if you get more people engaging with content that has your brand name in it, it's better than having less people engaging with content that has your brand name in it. And that's the way that I think about EMV at the highest level. But when you see these numbers and you see $150 million in EMV, this will give you an idea of what it is. Right? So this is a YouTube video from Manny, the makeup artist, Manny Mua, got 3 million views, about 50 years of watch time, which is about half the watch time of a Super Bowl ad. We would value this at around $150,000. So $150 million in EMV would be the equivalent of about 1,000 of these videos or about 500 Super Bowl ads in terms of exposure. So the metrics that we're going to cover today, because there are other metrics, but I think these are the ones that I think are most important. One is brand. So how am I doing as a brand? And, spoiler alert, Toto's doing it the right way. So share of voice is definitely the way that we recommend it. And we'll dive into that for why that's the reason. 2 is team. So how big should my team be? And then how do I justify each incremental hire that I make? And then the final one is influencers. So how do I choose who to work with and what criteria should I be using when I choose to work with them? So that when somebody from your influencer team presents you with a packet on like, hey, I want to invest $500,000 in this influencer who's never talked about me, you can say, hey, I don't know, can we rethink about this budget, right? So we'll start with brand metrics. So key brand metrics, the 2 that I would measure if I were to have these on a KPI spreadsheet as a CMO or CEO are share of voice and retention. These are the 2 things that I think are most important. Share of voice, the reason that I would emphasize that is it takes into account market dynamics. So as an example to Toto's presentation, the whole makeup industry tanked in 2020, right? Because you literally were wearing a mask and you couldn't, you weren't going out as much. And so if you were measuring it from like a top line EMV perspective, you'd say, oh, wow, we're not doing very well. But if you were to do it from a share of voice perspective, like Toto is doing, you can say, hey, we're actually still doing great. We are improving within our kind of particular area of focus. And then the second one is retention. I think retention is the strongest signal we've found for both future growth, and it's also the most actionable metric. And we'll look at that a little bit as to why that's the case. Share of voices is just an example. So, e.l.f. has had a really good year. Mass Cosmetics has had a really good year generally. And if you were to look at these metrics, so this is their Q1 metrics. And you'll notice from Q4 to Q1, they actually increased by 3%, which, maybe you'd say, oh, that wasn't great. My top line EMV only went up by 3%. But actually versus their competitive set, which would be Maybelline and NYX in this particular case, they were actually down 9%. So they actually outperformed their competitive set by 12%. And then secondarily, if you were to look at it on a year over year perspective, they grew 7% year over year versus their competitive set, which actually declined by 26%. So if I were e.l.f., I wouldn't say that I only grew by 7%. I would say that I gained significant share of voice versus my competitive set in this, as compared to last year. And so I think that's just really important, both and it could go in the positive direction as well, right? Say e.l.f. increased by 7%, but their competitive set increased by 30%, right? They actually wouldn't be doing all that well. In the same way as if your portfolio from a stock perspective is up by 10%, but the market's up by 25, you're actually underperforming the stock market, right? So that's the first one. The second one, when it comes to retention, so this is Adidas. And what we did was we broke Adidas's influencer community out into 3 different cohorts. So the first cohort is their retained influencers. So these are influencers that they retained from 2019 to 2020, meaning they talked about them at least once in 2019 and at least once in 2020. The difference being that the value that they provided as an organization or as a group of influencers declined by, call it 20%. And so although that group is still talking about them, they are providing significantly less value for us this year versus last year. Second, they also lost about 8,000 influencers that represented about $75 million worth of coverage. And obviously that is too high of a percentage, I would say, right? They're losing a lot of people. And then third, they added 8,400 new people, but the problem is that hardly offset what they lost and certainly didn't come close to offsetting what they churned, right? And so what this gives us is an annualized retention number of 66%, meaning the influencers from last year provided 66% as much value for us this year as they did last year. So that is Adidas. And if we were to compare this to Gymshark, so Gymshark and Adidas both get about the same amount of EMV. And for those that don't know Gymshark, they just got valued at $1.4 billion a few months ago by General Atlantic, which, as you know from Forma Brands, is a well-known and very reputable investor. So for them, if we were to look at their community, right, they had 1,000 influencers that they retained. But what you saw with their group was actual growth, right? So they went from $260 million in coverage to $300 million in coverage year over year. And so this is the equivalent of your same customers from the previous year buying more from you this year than they did last year, right? Which is great because then you can grow without having to go out and acquire anybody new. Second, although they did lose people, right, they lost a much smaller percentage. So they lost more than call it 60% less, right? So they did a much better job of retaining people on a year over year basis. And they added about twice as much coverage as they lost. So their new customer acquisition or new influencer acquisition in this case offset what they churned. And so for them, their annualized retention rate would be at 103%, meaning from last year to this year, their influencers would actually provide more value for them than they did the previous year. And so and I'd say the other thing to highlight here is from a productivity standpoint, what you'll notice is that Gymshark had about 1,000 in each one of these categories, and Adidas had about 8,000, meaning that Gymshark's group is significantly more potent, right? Providing significantly more value per person than Adidas's is. And on a year over year basis, Gymshark is growing at about 20% and Adidas is down about 20%. So pretty significant spread in terms of results. And so the reason I highlight this is one, I think it's a very, very good metric for measuring health. And it is highly, highly predictive of performance. You cannot have a leaky bucket and grow. It is impossible. It does not happen. I have never seen it, right? And so, because everybody tends to focus on this new acquisition, when if you were to look at Adidas, almost all of their coverage is coming from the same people year after year after year. And so if I was trying to solve this problem as Adidas, the way I would solve it is in a bucketed approach with each one of these groups. So I'd say, okay, how do I understand, how do I reach out, or how do I categorize these 7,000 people? Focus on them because I know they are the vast majority of the value that I receive and make sure that they're taken care of. On the loss side, how do I go back and reclaim some of these people? And on the new side, how do I make sure that I onboard them so that they have a really good experience the first time and that they stick around over time, right? So there's a very straightforward approach to solving this problem if you are Adidas. Other considerations, I mentioned it already, but top line EMV is a very poor signal for team performance and investment performance. Share of voice is a much stronger metric. And in some ways, we are the problem here in that we publish top line metrics. And we've been trying to kind of kick it as a bad habit. It is good to know that like skincare is up by 10% and makeup is down by 20%. But generally, if you're trying to actually measure performance, you need to take into account market dynamics. And then again, from a benchmarking perspective, choose competitors that are similar to you, both in size as well as in kind of category, right? So who are your direct competitors? You don't want to be too aspirational here because you will see significant differences in retention and other metrics for bigger brands versus smaller brands, right? They tend to move up in direct relationship. So that's brand. So let's talk about team. So the two team metrics I would think about, one is going to be community size. So how many people should I have on my team managing these relationships? If I were to go back to Adidas, right, Adidas had 24,000 influencers just in the US that talked about them in the last 2 years. I can assure you, I would be willing to bet my mortgage or my house on the fact that Adidas does not have a large enough team to manage all of those relationships effectively. I would imagine that Gymshark's team is bigger than Adidas's, but Gymshark has a community that's, 20% the size. And so the recommendation we have here is a 500-to-1 ratio. And I'm going to show you what happens when you underinvest in this. The second piece is this idea of relationship assignment. So when you're thinking about how to measure the incremental lift of an individual hire, that becomes very, very difficult if you are not measuring the impact that they're having. And we'll talk about how to do that. But these are the two things I would focus on. So the story I'm going to tell you here is about one of the best performing brands we track in any category. I'm not going to tell you who the brand is because, mostly it's irrelevant. And I also just not a good feel or look, right? So these are their metrics for 2019. And what you see is metrics that are very similar to Gymshark, right? Very strong, healthy community that is growing over time. They lost some people, but they actually added 4 times as many new people as they lost in terms of total coverage. Their annualized retention was at 113%, right? So these are all great metrics. Like this is top of the line, as not quite as good as you can get, but very, very good, right? So these are similar metrics to like what Tula had this year, right? So Tula or Youth to the People both had fantastic years, or Versed. I mean, you guys are all really good at this. This is next year, right? So that was 2019. This is 2020. And what you see in 2020 is not quite as good of a picture. So as opposed to 113% retention, they had 53% retention. And in terms of kind of new additions versus lost, they added $23 million worth of new coverage, but they lost 27 million, right? So they're losing more than they're gaining. And if you were to look at that retained community, right, they went from $150 million in coverage last year to only $96 million worth of coverage this year. And so that's bad, right? That's really, really not good. And this was not a 1-year trend. So if you're to look at the trend line for this brand over a 4-year time span, these are their annualized retention numbers. They went from 121% in 2017 up to 152% in 2018, which at their scale is probably one of the best numbers we've ever seen, then down to 113 and then down all the way to 55, right? And that's not good. But the reality is that this trend didn't happen in a year, right? This trend happened over multiple years. And what I mean by that is if we were to go back to this year of 2019 and we were to look at these metrics, what you'll see is they retained 2,300. I'd say about 2,300 people that talked about them last year and this year. But this spread here in terms of new versus lost, they added on a net basis about 2,000 entirely new relationships that year, right? So their community went from, call it 3,800 all the way up to, call it 6,000, right? So they almost doubled the total number of relationships that they needed to manage from 2018 to 2019. And that had happened several years in a row, where the total number of publishers, right? The total number of influencers doubled and doubled and doubled, but their team size did not grow to match the size of that community. And then what happens as you get into the following years is, that influencer who loved your brand last year and talked about you 50 times last year, all of a sudden the Tula team's showing them a little love, right? The Youth to the People team's showing them a little love. They're sending them some product. They're inviting them to events. They're building those relationships. And those people will stick with you, but they talk about you 30% less this year than they did last year. And as much as this team is working hard, right? They can work as hard as they want. If the team size that managed 2,000 relationships is roughly the same size as the one that's supposed to manage 9,000 relationships, like it's not going to work, right? They cannot work hard enough to actually solve that problem. And so for us, this is something that we think is critically important, and particularly important for brands that are scaling up really quickly, is to understand roughly how big should your team be, right? And then also to justify each hire. So let's say that I am this brand and I am facing this problem. I've got 50% retention. This is really bad. I know that today I cannot hire enough people to manage all of these relationships, right? Let's say there's 9,000 relationships over the last 2 years that I am concerned with, and I have a team of 4 people, right? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by carving out the 2,000 most important relationships. Okay, out of this 9,000, these are the 2,000 that we think are most important that we're going to focus on. And then what we're going to do is we're going to assign either individually or as a group those relationships. And we're going to measure, okay, now that you have focused on these 2,000 people, what has been the change over time from previous performance to future performance? And if you want to get really complex, you can benchmark that group of 2,000 versus the other 7,000, right? And then you say, okay, and what I'm going to do is for the next person that I hire, like I'm going to hire another person, I'm going to go from 4 to 5. I'm going to take out the next 500 people, and that's going to be your job. Your job is to get to know their birth dates, their dogs' names, their favorite products. You have a budget, you can gift them, you can get coffee, you can do yoga, whatever you want to do. Your job is that territory of 500 relationships. In the same way that you would have somebody assigned to, oh, you're responsible for Ulta in North America, or you're responsible for this particular, account management or sales territory. And then you measure, okay, now that I've hired this person and I've given them this job, how is that group doing versus how they were doing previously? And then you can keep knocking that out one after one after one and justify each incremental hire that you're making. And realistically, as much as this becomes like this mystical influencer thing, this is almost as much about clienteling as it is about, influencers. Like these are people that are actively talking about your brand that generally have tens of thousands, upwards of millions of followers that are generally being ignored because you don't have a team that's big enough to actually manage all the relationships. And so that's the way that I recommend kind of doing the relationship assignment concept. And then in terms of other things to take into account, one is posting frequency, right? So if you're a fragrance brand, people talk about you a couple times a year. There's not that much to talk about versus if you are a makeup brand or an apparel brand, right? These are going to be categories that get talked about much more frequently. And so your ratios should adjust to that, right? Like it's not a flat 500 to 1 for everybody. And then the second piece is, if you're to look at a team like Toto, right, it's not that he has like 40 relationship managers, right? He has people that are analysts. He has people that are, negotiate contracts. He has people that purely focus on the analytics, right? And then he also has people that focus on relationship management. And so roles will become more specialized over time versus, when you're a big brand versus being a smaller brand. And so that's the team metrics. And then the final one is just ambassador metrics, right? So if I were choosing, like if I, had somebody present to me, I want to invest in this influencer, these are the two things that I would look at. The first thing is, do they have brand and do they have category affinity? And what I mean by that is not, does their audience care about makeup or does their audience care about luxury? What I care about is, have they outwardly expressed that they care about this category? Have they talked about it on social? Have they talked about it, you can go all the way to press, but have they talked about it in a way that's measurable? And the reason that ends up becoming so important is, one, if they tend to have a lot more trust with their audience when it comes to that topic, versus if I am giving you, advice on taxes, you should not take it because I don't talk about taxes. I don't know taxes. It is not my problem to solve. You should talk to your tax accountant, right? They have specialization within that category and then trust from their audience within that category. And then you have to think about long-term dynamics. For some of these people, they will be talking about your brand for 10 to 30 years, right? In the same way that Glamour Magazine, how long has Glamour Magazine talked about L'Oreal Paris? It's not about a one-year relationship. And so if you forge these relationships with people that have specialization within particular categories, in terms of the lifetime value of that investment, it pays out over time versus having a very short-term mindset, right? So both trust and long-term value, right? The second piece I would look at is going to be community engagement. So how healthy is their audience? What is their engagement rate relative to their competitive set? And is their audience and engagement, total engagement growing over time? These are the two predictors, best predictors for whether or not their audience will grow in the future. And, ideally the bet you are placing is on somebody that will get bigger over time, not somebody that will get stronger over time. So those are the two metrics to pay attention to there. And again, two things to think about. One is avoid, I don't give a shit what their EMV per post is. We get asked about all the time. That is not what matters. That is not what I pay attention to. Just because Alex Rodriguez gets a lot of EMV per post doesn't mean that he's going to help my makeup brand all that much. Although I'm sure J-Lo doesn't mind him talking about them, right? And then pure follower count, right? Which is one of fairly obvious, but that number is highly manipulated. The other thing to think about is kind of community dynamics and second order effects, right? So positive and negative externalities. So when you pay somebody, that information very commonly gets communicated to other people. These are very tightly knit communities. And so you can imagine if I am a brand and I have a bunch of people, I'm Adidas, I have a bunch of people that love me, 24,000 influencers, one of the biggest communities we track. And I decide, hey, I know I've got 24,000 people to choose from, but I'm going to go choose this other person that's never talked about Adidas. And I'm going to pay them to be an ambassador to the brand, right? How do all of those other people feel about that? Hey, why are you paying her or him and not paying me? Like, I love the brand. I talk about it all the time. Like, screw you guys, right? And that has negative effects on the rest of the community's likelihood to talk about you. And alternatively, if you take somebody who's a huge fan of the brand, talking about you all the time, and you decide to make them the face of the brand, or you decide to do a collaboration with them, or you decide to regram them on your Instagram account, all of those have positive externalities or positive second order effects, where now that person goes, oh, wow, I was talking about this brand all the time, and look what I got out of it. This is really cool. And everybody else goes, oh, wow, look at, if you work with Tula, they're going to put you on a paid program. You'll get an affiliate link. You'll get free product. You'll get all this cool stuff. Maybe I should talk about Tula, right? So really think about that, because these are very tightly knit communities and they communicate a lot. And so whatever you do with one person has big impacts on the rest of the group. And that's it, right? So again, to recap, key metrics that I would focus on at a brand level: do share of voice and retention. Those are the two things I would have in my KPI sheet. From a kind of team level, do it by relationship assignment. So what is the contribution of each individual team member? And then what is my ratio of team members to total community size, right? Is that out of whack? Am I under investing? And then the final one is, thinking about an influencer you invest in. Before I invest in this person, do they have a strong history of supporting me? Do they have a strong history of supporting the category? And what is the engagement rate and general growth of their audience, right? That will give you, are they going to grow in the future? And when they talk about me, does this deliver long-term value that's trusted by the audience itself?